Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the second episode of the story, in which 3rd Hokage Sarutobi Hiruzen transports Naruto to an alternate universe where Minato is still alive. Soon, Minato begins to regard this Naruto from another universe as his own son. Will Minato from the alternate universe return Naruto to his original universe? This story is from Random Flyer. Please support him, her. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. Kakashi landed on the front steps of the Hokage Tower tired, dirty, hungry, and glad to be home more than anything. His shower called to him as well as his bed, but both would have to wait till he reported to the Hokage. Just a quick check-in with Minato Sensei to let the man know that he was still alive. Then, he would be able to douse himself with hot water and sleep for at least several days before someone started asking about his mission report. Keeping that thought in mind, Kakashi trudged through the doors, making his way up the steps toward the Hokage's office. He barely registered the harried activity around him as he moved through the hall, intent only on seeing his sensei and leaving immediately afterward. His path was blocked, however, when he ran headlong into a Chunin coming out of Minato's office. They bumped into each other, papers spilling from the desk ninja's hands across the floor. "Oh, excuse me, Anbyusen," the Chunin said distractedly bending down to pick up the papers, a brief flash of dismay crossing his face. "Ma, don't worry about it," Kakashi replied. He really should help pick those up, but bending down that far seemed like too much of an effort. He moved to go around and through the door but the Chunin stopped him before he could grasp the handle. "If you're looking for Hokage-sama, he isn't here." If anything, the Chunin only looked more dismayed at the pronouncement, shuffling the papers in his hands. "Isn't here?" Kakashi asked, vaguely aware that he sounded slower than the average Anbu was supposed to, but if the other shinobi couldn't tell by smell alone that he had just returned from a mission, then there was no hope for the Chunin. Still, Minato Sensei was always in the office. "What do you mean he isn't here?" "He isn't here," the Chunin replied, sounding increasingly frantic. "He's taken a day off. Yesterday he was only in for a few hours and then today he came by to say he was taking a personal day. These papers need to get signed." He shook the pile with both hands, emphasizing the point. Kakashi was less concerned with signing papers than he was with the fact that Minato suddenly seemed to be taking time for himself. Minato Sensei never took a day off, not one in the past 8 years. The last personal day the Hokage had taken had been for the birth of his son. It hadn't turned out well. The Chunin was still babbling about forms and papers needing signatures and approval, cancelled meetings, and obtaining consent for matters that couldn't be decided without the Hokage. None of this mattered to Kakashi. All he cared about was checking in, proving he was still alive and well to his sensei, making sure that his sensei was alive and well, then collapsing into bed. That thought in his mind, and feeling a little more awake at the turn of events, Kakashi turned from the babbling Chunin and headed back down the hall for the nearest window. He was stopped again when the Chunin ran ahead of him and held out the papers. "If you're going to check in with him, Anbyusen, could you please take these to Hokage-sama? They really do need to be signed today." Kakashi took the papers, more to get the Chunin out of the way than anything. He was too tired to deal with desk shinobi and the path of least resistance looked the best at the moment. Kakashi brushed away the Chunin's quick bow of thanks with a tired wave of his hand, then, the Chunin disappeared in the other direction. Kakashi rolled up the forms and pushed open the first window he came to, leaping across to the closest building. It took more time than usual to reach the housel. Kakashi was tired and even with the spike of energy he'd gotten from hearing about Minato's unusual behavior, his body was drained. When he reached the house he didn't even make the effort of moving to the front door. Instead, he headed straight for the nearest window, landing tiredly on the ledge and sliding open the pane. Kakashi froze at the vision of a miniature Minato sitting on the floor of the sitting room, crayons and papers strewn around him. For a moment, his mind went blank at the identical, if smaller, blonde head. He reached up to rub his eye but stopped when he remembered he was still wearing his ANBU mask. He really should have taken an hour or two on the way back to the village to catch a nap instead of pushing through. He was having hallucinations. Then, the blonde head came up to reveal an equally identical set of blue eyes that landed on Kakashi's position, perched in the window. The boy yelled, throwing an accusatory finger at the masked man, "It's you." "Me?" the ANBU repeated confused, trying to dredge up any reason that a miniature copy of his sensei would know him or even how such a boy could exist. "Is everything all right? I thought I heard a yell." Minato appeared from around the corner dressed in his blue shinobi uniform, though without his Hokage coat or jounin vest. He stopped when he spotted Kakashi, crouched on the window sill, half in the room. "Oh, you're back, good." "Hokage-sama," Kakashi greeted, sliding into the room with a small bow. He glanced at the boy still sitting on the floor, then back at Minato, amazed at the likeness between the two. "You look exhausted," Minato said, gaze running up and down Kakashi's weary form. He paused in a moment of consideration before continuing with a casual wave. "And you need a bath. I can get your report later. Go home, bathe, sleep, and eat. You have the next 2 weeks to rest from your last assignment. Oh, and if you see Kakashi, tell him I want to see him tomorrow morning. And not sooner." The last was said in the firm tone that told Kakashi his sensei was serious. The ANBU glanced down at the boy looking up at him from the floor with wide curious eyes, Minato's eyes. He was missing something. Kakashi couldn't help but feel it should have been obvious. He should be able to figure it out with a little bit of thought, but his brain was slow and his mind sluggish. He'd been out on a mission for too long and he had pushed himself to return too quickly. He wouldn't be figuring out any mysteries, even obvious ones, until he'd had some rest. Kakashi heaved a sigh, wanting to know but wanting his own bed at the same time. "Hi, Hokage-sama. They wanted you to sign these forms," he said, belatedly remembering the papers and placing them on the window sill. He turned to the window. Minato didn't seem to be in trouble at the moment. The man looked fine, healthy, and even a little happier than Kakashi remembered seeing him in recent years. Reassured that nothing was amiss and desperately needing rest, Kakashi slipped out the window and took the shortest path home. "XXXXX, who was that?" Naruto asked, looking up at Minato. "That," Minato said, moving to sit down on the couch near Naruto, "was Dog. He's one of my most trusted ANBU. What were you yelling about earlier?" Naruto shuffled around so that he faced Minato, though he remained seated on the floor. The books had been picked up and replaced on the shelves. Minato and Jiraiya had made sure to place any books with questionable or dangerous content on the highest shelves where the 8-year-old wouldn't be able to reach them. Minato was planning on moving the books in question to his office once that space was cleaned, organized, and had room, but at the moment the office was still a disaster. Now the only thing out of place in the sitting room were the sheets of paper and crayons fanned out around Naruto, depicting his many masterpieces of art. Glancing at some of the closest drawings, Minato recognized Kushina's artistic skill, or lack thereof. If he wanted Naruto to become a seal master, then he was going to have to put in a little extra work. "I think I've seen that mask before," Naruto said, looking closely at the tip of a blunt crayon before putting it back on the floor and turning his full attention to Minato. "You have?" Minato asked. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on his knees and clasping his hands. He tried to think of the implications of that fact. "When?" "That was the mask the guy who brought me to the Hokage was wearing. I might have seen him before that, but those masked guys never stay around long." Naruto shrugged, fiddling with another crayon, peeling the paper wrapping off more than was needed. It wasn't a certainty, Minato knew, but it was a chance that the Kakashi in Naruto's world was also Dog. It could mean that his student was looking after his son in that other place, which was something of a comforting thought. However, Minato would have preferred that Kakashi adopt Naruto, if the child was ever orphaned. Thinking of his own Kakashi and all the hurt the man carried as well as his stigma about families, Minato wouldn't be surprised that the silver-haired ninja would be reluctant to make such a commitment. Minato hesitated slightly before silently bracing himself for his next question. He wasn't sure he wanted to ask or no, but curiosity won. Who takes care of you there? He was relieved at the casual tone he managed. Oh, Naruto shifted, bringing a hand up to scratch the back of his head. The old man comes and checks in on me sometimes, but I have my own place. I don't need anyone to look after me. Naruto looked up with a wide grin across his face. It took effort to return the smile. Naruto's wide grin didn't fool him, he could see the brittleness behind it. He knew about the months spent perfecting it till it hid the loneliness from everyone, but Minato saw through it easily. He had worn the same expression more than once to convince his sensei and students that he was fine after Kushina's death. It hadn't worked on them at the time either. His son shouldn't have known how to make that expression. No one else? He asked, half to himself. Well, Iruka sensei takes me out to ramen sometimes. He gets me Ichiraku's ramen, it's the best in the whole world. Naruto declared with enthusiasm. Though, he also yells at me when I get in trouble and not just in school either. Minato's expression eased in a genuine grin. Iruka, huh? Minato remembered seeing the man around the village, but had never gotten to know him very well. That's because he cares about you, Minato said, reviving what little he knew about the academy instructor. The younger man was something of a mother hen from what Minato had seen and heard. He made a mental note to pay more attention to the man in the future before turning back to the conversation, forcing himself to continue. What happened to your parents, do you know? This time Naruto didn't answer right away, squirming where he sat as he looked down to the rainbow of crayons scattered around him. He shrugged, a failed attempt at being casual. I don't know. No one ever told me. His tone didn't invite further probing. Wincing, Minato hesitated to continue. Naruto was hunching in on himself, a slight curl to his shoulders as he seemed to closely inspect his array of crayons. Minato chose his words carefully. You remember the conversation we had yesterday morning, right, Naruto-kun? The younger blonde looked up to Minato, confusion in his eyes. About how things are different here from your own Konoha, Minato said, hoping to remind Naruto. He spoke slowly, trying to find the right words. People who are gone here, like the Sandaime, are there in your Konoha. And people who are gone in your Konoha might still be here. Naruto frowned at him, still not understanding what Minato was trying to say. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Minato ran a hand down his face as he struggled with what he wanted to say, how best to communicate his thoughts. Just breaking the news to the child seemed too harsh. Biting back a groan of frustration, he tried a different angle. You know, I was an orphan growing up, too. You? Naruto asked, voice rising in surprise. He sat a little straighter and dropped the crayon he'd been fiddling with to turn his entire attention to the older man. Minato nodded, encouraged by the new interest Naruto directed toward him and the focus in the boy's gaze. So I understand what it's been like for you. A little, he suppressed a grimace, thinking of the additional complications being a Jinchuriki would bring. The stumble had made him lose steam, but he plowed on anyway. I know it's probably difficult believing there's someone out there that will be there for you. But like I said, this is a new world for you, right? There are different circumstances here, so even though you didn't have anyone there doesn't mean it's the same here. Minato shook his head as Naruto's confusion came back in full, though there was the spark of an idea behind his eyes. The boy crossed his arms over his chest, face scrunching in concentration. So you mean I might find someone to look after me here? There was still doubt and disbelief in his voice. No, I mean you already have someone here. Minato shifted in his seat and ran his hand over his face again in a bout of frustration. The subtle approach obviously wasn't working. Naruto clearly needed things stated plainly, like Kushina had. What I'm trying to say is, man, am I hungry? Jiraiya burst into the room, interrupting Minato and drowning out what he was about to say. When are we going to get lunch, anyway? I know this great ramen stand in town. Both blondes turned to him in surprise, one face lighting up at the mention of lunch, the other shooting a narrowed glare at the interruption. Naruto leapt to his feet, punching the air in excitement. Yeah. Ramen, the boy cried, all thoughts of the previous conversation gone. Oh. Jiraiya exclaimed in over-exaggerated enthusiasm to match Naruto's, you like ramen, then? It's the best. Naruto agreed with a fervent nod and a wide smile. And Ichiraku's ramen is the best of all. Can we go there? He ran up to the white-haired man, scattering a few drawings and crayons further across the floor, hands clenched and body tense in anticipation. Jiraiya grinned and ruffled Naruto's head. Isn't it lucky, that's exactly where I was planning on going? I'd say stay here for lunch, but I still don't trust Minato-kun's cooking skills. He's so out of practice. Naruto let out another whoop of joy, dancing on the spot before running to the door. I'll get my sandals. Jiraiya turned to watch Naruto leave. Minato, however, kept his eyes on his sensei throughout the whole exchange. The Hokage's expression wasn't much more forgiving than when the Sannin had first interrupted and he hadn't moved from his seat on the couch. Now, with Naruto gone, Minato slowly stood up from his perch. You have terrible timing, you know that, sensei? Jiraiya shrugged, unaffected by Minato's dark look. I've been told that before, though in this case I think I'm right on time. I was about to explain to him, Minato bit out, turning to the papers littering the area and bending to pick them up with quick movements. Jiraiya sighed and moved to help Minato. Exactly my point. It's too soon to be telling him those things. There's still too much we don't know. Don't know? Minato looked up from his cleaning and watched his sensei shuffling some of the bright crayon drawings. When he spoke again his voice was muted to a lower level. He's my son and he's been alone his entire life. That's all I need to know. In his grip, Minato could feel a few of the crayons snap from pressure. Jiraiya scooped up the last few pictures, taking his time before answering. I know, and that's why we need to be cautious in how we do things, what we tell him. He's had it hard enough without giving him false hope. Look, Jiraiya's shoulders dropped slightly, his voice low and serious. He turned to face Minato square on and hands at his side. You're my student and for all practical purposes he's my godson. I don't want either of you hurt if I can prevent it. We still don't know all the facts of what happened over there. We don't know if Naruto will even be able to stay here. There's no way to tell if the Sandame's technique used to send him here is permanent or if it has side effects that could be harmful. What will it do to him to gain a father here if he has to lose him all over again? Minato didn't respond. There was nothing to say to that. He stood silent, shoulders slumped and gaze turned down to the floor at the thought that he wouldn't be able to keep Naruto. The idea hadn't occurred to him and now that it was pointed out he couldn't stop the cold hand that gripped his heart at the thought. Hell, Jiraiya continued, voice more thoughtful as though he were speaking mainly to himself. They might even just demand that we return him. Naruto is that other Konoha's Jinchuriki, after all, and they won't want to let him go so easily. They'd have a fight on their hands, Minato responded without thinking. He tensed after uttering the words, immediately feeling Jiraiya's disapproving eyes on his back. Another crayon snapped in his grasp. A moment of silence stretched out while neither man moved. Then, Jiraiya turned his attention to the drawings in his hands, leafing through them absently. I'm just saying we need to know more of the situation before we do anything rash. You're already stuck in this position. Let's spare the breath the same stress until we know for sure, all right? Minato finally looked up from the floor. I suppose you're right. I also suppose this leaves us little choice except to attempt contact with the Sandame. He looked at Jiraiya, noticing that the man was froze in place, staring at a picture with muted shock. What's wrong? Jiraiya wordlessly turned the drawing around to face Minato. At first, the Hokage didn't know what upset the older man. The picture looked like a slightly lopsided picture of a very gnarled tree that spread across the entire page. He opened his mouth to ask what the matter was when his eyes caught what his sensei had seen. The leaves spread across the top half of the page weren't leaves at all, but a section of a seal, a very complicated and extensive seal. Minato took the paper, eyes raking over the green crayon marks before he turned to the pictures he held in his own hand. He shuffled through them, scanning the images with careful eyes while Jiraiya did the same with the papers he'd already perused. In several pictures, Minato found clear sections of a seal and more areas in other pictures that could have been part of a seal but were too clumsy due to the crayon to tell. What is this? Minato asked, not expecting an answer but needing to voice the question anyway. He finally cycled back to the first page, the one with the tree and the largest example of the seal he'd seen. He couldn't tell much from the small section, but he could tell that the examples drawn out for them were only parts of a much larger seal, one he'd never seen before, and that Naruto should not have any ability to draw in the first place. I don't know, Jiraiya said, pulling out specific drawing that Minato guessed had other examples of partially drawn seal diagrams, but the sooner we talk to Sensei, the better. Oi! Naruto called, startling both men from their thoughts. Are we going or not? I'm starving. We're coming, Minato said as Jiraiya grabbed the papers from his hands. He looked at the older man as Jiraiya stowed the drawing securely inside his shirt. Jiraiya gave Minato one last serious look before brightening his expression and turning to Naruto and moving to the door. You need to learn patience, brat. A shinobi needs to have patience if they're going to excel. Patience? Naruto repeated, face screwing up at the idea. But I'm hungry now. Maybe we should wait a little longer, just so you can learn the lesson. Jiraiya laughed as Naruto's face dropped in horror. Minato followed them into the entrance hall, trying to focus on the light banter between his sensei and his son. The discovery and implications of the seals buried in Naruto's pictures whirled through his thoughts, along with the possibility that Naruto wouldn't be able to stay. It was too much to think of right then. He needed to wait until he had a moment of quiet to sort it all out and then talk about it in depth with Jiraiya. One final mental push and he shoved the worrying thought to the side and instead concentrated on enjoying lunch with his son. XXXXX, stop moving, you brat. Naruto stilled his squirming, though he narrowed his eyes at his tormentor, a defiant pout on his face. I don't see why I have to get another exam. I was at the hospital yesterday. Brown eyes stared back at Naruto as both medic and patient glared at each other, neither one wanting to look away first. Sure, Naruto thought as the medic forcibly repositioned him on the desk as he tried to squirm off again. The medic lady was a pretty blonde, but she had a bad temper and her bedside manner left something to be desired. Minato and Jiraiya said that her name was Tsunade. At first, Naruto thought she was young, but then he'd found out she'd been Jiraiya's teammate. That made her old, way older than she looked. Naruto failed to notice that Tsunade's bedside manner had disappeared as he made a verbal comment on that observation. Just bear with us for a little longer, Naruto-kun, the other medic, a lady named Rin, said. She was a brunette with two thick purple marks on either side of her face from jaw to cheek and was much nicer than old lady Tsunade. We just want to make sure you're completely healed. Naruto huffed but stilled to let the two women finish checking over him with glowing hands. His eyes flicked to the side of the sitting room, relieved to see Minato still there leaning against the side of the couch, arms crossed over his chest. The Hokage watched the proceedings with bright eyes and a twitching mouth. It looked like he was fighting a smile. Taking a deep breath, Naruto braced himself to wait for the unending exam to be over. For a quick checkup it was taking an awfully long time. He'd never had a medic look over him for so long or so thoroughly, much less two at once. They spent a lot of time on his stomach, which tickled and made him squirm again, earning another growl from Tsunade. The silence settled in the room. Naruto let his mind wander, bored with everything and wanting nothing more than to jump off the desk they'd pulled out from the wall for him to sit on during the exam. Minato hadn't wanted to go back to the hospital for it. He hadn't said why exactly, but Naruto wasn't going to complain. Naruto's thoughts turned back to the thing that was still in the back of his head, drawn like metal to a magnet. It seemed like whenever he wasn't distracted by something, whenever had a moment for just his own thoughts, they inevitably focused on the half-thought that he still couldn't remember. It had something to do with the old man, of that Naruto was relatively sure, since whenever he thought about the Sandaime the sensation got stronger. Tsunade hummed thoughtfully, drawing Naruto from his circling thoughts. Her hands were now on his head. Through the soft green glow that circled her hands and by extension Naruto's head, he could see her face scrunched in concentration. It only lasted a moment more before the woman dropped her hands and turned back to her bag. Now only Rin's hands pressed into his back, but they were removed a moment later as well. The brunette turned to some paper laid out on the table and began writing notes across the white sheets. "Arm," Tsunade said, gesturing with one hand. The other held a syringe and needle. Naruto grimaced at the sight, not wanting to get stuck with a needle, but his eyes flickered over to Minato again and he straightened his back and stuck out his arm. He didn't let himself wince when the needle poked into his skin, surprisingly gentle considering it was Tsunade sticking him. He was determined to be brave in front of his hero. After all, Naruto didn't want Minato to think that he was afraid of something stupid like a needle. Things were going so well and Minato seemed like he really liked Naruto. From the moment they'd gotten up and Minato had burnt breakfast, forcing them to have just toast, to the lunch out with Jiraiya at Ichiraku's, Naruto couldn't think of a better morning in his life. He didn't want to mess everything up by giving Minato a reason not to like him. So he held his breath and quashed the slightly queasy feeling in his stomach as he watched Tsunade draw blood from his arms and fill the syringe. "You're doing very well," Rin smiled at him again and Naruto grinned back, glad for the distraction as the needle was pulled from his arm. Tsunade capped the needle and slipped it into her small medical bag. "Well, that's it," she said, turning to Minato. "I wonder why you had both myself and Rinsen over here, Minato-kun. The kid's fine, for the most part. The wound is all healed, surprisingly fast, actually. Though, it might still be sore for a little longer. He's underweight, too, but I'm sure you'll remedy that if you don't kill him first." Minato rolled his eyes as Jiraiya entered the room. "What, done already?" the new arrival asked, looking between Tsunade, Rin, and Minato. "What do you mean already?" Naruto asked, jumping off the table. "That took forever." "It wasn't that bad," Rin chuckled, ruffling Naruto's hair before she gathered up the notes from the desk. She turned to Minato. "Sensei, perhaps we can find something for Naruto to do while we talk things over in more detail." "What? Why can't I be in the talk?" Naruto asked, feeling a little left out at the thought of everyone leaving to talk about him. "You wouldn't be interested anyway. It's going to be boring medical talk that will probably just go over your head. Besides, it's only going to boil down to you eating more vegetables," Jiraiya said, walking over to Naruto and poking him in the head. He pulled the notes out of Rin's hands and took out the blank sheets before turning Naruto around to face the desk again. He slapped the blank sheets of paper on the desk along with a pencil. "Why don't you draw me some pictures while the adults go in the other room and talk about boring adult things?" Naruto glared at the older man as Jiraiya turned and left the room, followed by Tsunade. Rin smiled as she walked out of the door, trailing after the other two. "Don't worry, Naruto-kun," Minato said, coming over and ruffling Naruto's hair. "We shouldn't be too long." "Fine," Naruto huffed before smiling. "Afterwards, can you teach some cool ninja stuff?" Then I'll be better than anyone when I go back to the academy. Minato's grin only spread wider. I'd love to teach you something after we're done, but be patient till then. Your earlier drawings were very nice, I'd love to see more. Alright. Naruto agreed. He wasn't particularly interested in drawing more since he'd done that before lunch, but if Minato wanted to see more of his pictures then he'd be happy to draw more. Pulling the chair out and settling in, Naruto heard the door click shut as he drew the paper and pencil toward him. He'd have to draw some really good pictures. No one had ever wanted to see his pictures before, so he had to make these count. Tongue between his teeth, Naruto set to work. XXXXX. The frown was set on Sarutobi's face. It felt like it was engraved there, permanent and unchanging except to increase in severity. Despite the good news concerning their efforts against the IWA Shinobi, his eyes were fixed on the point on the map that depicted the Hokage Tower. It was still out of reach, still in control of the Amigakure Shinobi. If I didn't know better, I'd say they knew what we were planning, the Amigakure forces, that is. Kakashi said, his slumped posture looking too authentic though those who knew him well to tell the difference. Sarutobi knew him well and could see the exhaustion in Kakashi's stance. The IWA Nin had no idea what hit them, which means either IWA wasn't as prepared as Amigakure, or the two forces are not sharing all their information with each other. Sarutobi nodded, grunting his agreement. Let us hope it is the latter. That would mean they are divided, and a divided force is almost always easier to deal with. We may very well have a spy in our midst. Kakashi only nodded, the eye visible through his mask, tired and muted. Is Naruto safe? Somewhere where they won't get to him? He is as safe as I can make him, Sarutobi replied, indicating the topic should be dropped. Hi, Hokage-sama, Kakashi said quietly, head bowed. What do you intend to do if we do have a spy? Sarutobi looked up from the map and stared at Kakashi for several moments. Do you think we do? The Kapinin took a moment to reply, face covered by two separate masks. Yes. Heaving a sigh, the old Hokage slumped just a bit in his seat. We must regain the Hokage Tower. We have the IWA forces on the run and have taken back the main gate, but the tower is too valuable to leave in Amigakure's hands for long. But first we need to rid ourselves of this spy. Any effort will be undermined because of him. Find the spy, by whatever means necessary. Kakashi nodded, bowing to the Hokage before turning from the room. The reprieve from the battlefield was more than welcome since he was running dangerously low on chakra, but this new assignment exposed him to an entirely different set of problems. Heading back to the emergency shelter, Kakashi set his mind on how to devise a trap for a spy. Well, what did you find? Minato asked as he closed the door for the spare office on the first floor. The room hadn't been used in years and sat covered with dust like many of the spare bedrooms on the second floor. Jiraiya was just able to throw up a quick privacy seal before Minato lost control of his curiosity. Geez, Tsunade grumbled to herself as she ran a hand over a dusty box. You'd think we'd at least be able to talk in your regular office. It might be more comfortable. Minato shook his head, but Jiraiya beat him to the answer. It's still too messy. Our illustrious Hokage has a difficult time keeping all of his books and scrolls put away. Jiraiya's dry tone made Minato roll his eyes. Sensei, you used to be much better at that sort of thing, Rin admonished, and now that Naruto-kun will be staying with you, you need to set a good example. Minato nodded his head in a quick, jerking motion. I'm working on it. Now can we get back to what's going on with Naruto? Fine, Tsuji huffed with a long-suffering sigh. Though you still owe me an explanation for how and why he's here. You say he's your son but don't explain how that's possible. The only reason I didn't force you to take a temporary leave of absence is because Jiraiya here backs you up and you've already taken the day off from work. Minato opened his mouth to respond when a hollow tapping cut through his planned reply. As one, the group turned toward the window only to find a one-eyed, white-haired ninja crouching on the windowsill outside. Minato unlocked the window and slid it open for Kakashi to slip through, a disapproving frown on the Hokage's lips. "I thought I told you to come back tomorrow," Minato said, closing and relatching the window. "I took a nap," Kakashi defended himself. He moved over to Rin and settled himself next to her, leaning against a large box. Besides, who can sleep when there's an as of yet unexplained miniature clone of their sensei running around his house? "I'm assuming it has something to do with that mirror." "What mirror?" Tsunade asked, turning to Minato. Minato sighed, knowing he wouldn't get a further explanation of Naruto's medical state until he explained. "Months ago, I attempted to recreate the Sandaime seeing crystal. In my experiments, I accidentally created a window into another version of our own world, another possibility of how events could have happened. In that world, the Sandaime was still alive, though I, myself, was dead. We've been conversing for the past several months." "You've been talking to Sarutobi Sensei?" Tsunade asked in shock. "How do you know it wasn't some kind of trick?" "I was very careful in verifying his identity. I sat in on one of the conversations, as well." Kakashi spoke up. "The Sandaime didn't know I was listening in, but I believe he was who he claimed to be." Tsunade responded with a skeptical hum. Her arms were crossed and her expression was disbelieving, but she didn't say anything, so Minato continued. "2 nights ago, I went down to see if the Sandaime was available for a talk. When I arrived to the room holding the mirror, I found Naruto on the floor, unconscious and wounded. The mirror wasn't activated, but there is no other way he could have gotten into the room. Questioning him later verified that he is from the other Konoha." Minato hesitated, thinking about the Kyuubi sealed in his son. Perhaps it was shame, but he didn't want to tell anyone what his other self had done. However, he seriously doubted he would be able to keep it a secret. Jiraiya already knew, after all. He didn't need to say anything at the moment, though, as Kakashi was already speaking. "Well, that explains why he looks exactly like you. Never mentioned you had a son in that other place." "I didn't know I had a son there, not until he appeared here," Minato replied. "Why wouldn't Sensei tell you about him?" Tsunade asked, her eyes slightly narrowed and a frown pulling at her mouth. "As I said, I'm dead in that world. Naruto is an orphan. You must have noticed how he doesn't even recognize me." Keeping the pained sting out of his words was harder than Minato imagined, but he managed. "Now do you have the results of the exam?" Tsunade didn't answer right away. She stared at him as he looked at her, the rest of the room watching them both in silence. "Yes," she finally said, not moving from her spot against the boxes. "There's an unusual chakra signature, not his, emanating from his stomach. If I were to hazard a guess, I'd say something has been sealed into the boy." Tsunade turned a sidelong glance to Minato that made the younger man sigh. "He has the Kyuubi no Yoko sealed inside of him," Minato admitted after a moment. He had no doubt the people in the room would treat Naruto the same, but he did not want the information to spread. The villagers would not be so kind. Silence filled the room. The question about who had sealed the Kyuubi hung in the air, but thankfully no one asked, and Minato stubbornly refused to say without being specifically asked. "So that played out differently in the other world as well," Kakashi said, half to himself, his one visible eye furrowed above his black face mask. "That would explain the foreign chakra," Rin said as she nodded, then turned as Tsunade spoke. "It explains the first but not the second." "Second?" Minato asked, alarmed at the thought of 3 different chakra signatures in one person, especially his son. Coping with one foreign chakra for a long period of time was stressful enough on the body, but 2? He didn't know how that would affect someone, and Naruto was so young. Tsunade's next statement did nothing to ease Minato's worry. "The other chakra is in his head. It was extremely subdued, almost non-existent. I would have overlooked it except it flared briefly just as I was scanning his head." Tsunade delivered the information in a clinical and level tone. Did it seem harmful? Jiraiya asked, frown on his face. The chakra itself isn't malicious in nature, not like the Kyuubi's, but the demon fox is sealed away. It's contained and mostly separated from Naruto's own chakra. This other chakra, however, is not. From what I can tell, it's acting directly on him, though I can't say how or to what effect exactly. Minato didn't like the sound of that at all. He fought back his initial knee-jerk response to go back to his son, if only to make sure Naruto was alright, and forced himself to think. It's in his head and dormant most of the time. He asked to verify those facts, mind whirling at the possible reasons for the other chakra. Tsunade nodded. Perhaps some form of genjutsu? Rin suggested, voicing Minato's own first guess. It's possible, Tsunade agreed, but without commitment. Minato frowned at the floor, his mind working furiously with the new information. It seemed all he received were new questions and never any definitive answers. First Naruto's sudden appearance, then the Kyuubi, Naruto's reaction to the mirror, the partial seals in his pictures, and now this second foreign chakra in his head. It was one new puzzle piece after another and few were connecting in any clear way. He had no doubt they were all related to each other, but the question was how they were related. What was harmless and what was a potential threat? He had no way to tell for sure, not with the small amount of information they had. Sensei, do you still have those drawings? Minato asked. They were laying everything out in regard to Naruto, and it would be helpful to have as many opinions on the information as possible. Jiraiya pulled out the now slightly crinkled drawings. He flipped through several, pulling out the best examples and placing them on top. Tsunade moved next to him and peered over at the topmost picture, curious. Naruto drew these earlier, Minato explained as the head medic reached out and took the first picture in the stack. Jiraiya handed out two other drawings to Kakashi and Rin. Silence reigned for a few moments as the three looked over the drawings and Minato wondered who would see it first. None of the others were seals masters up to his or Jiraiya's ability, but they were accomplished and learned enough to tell the difference between seal markings and scribbles. Don't tell me, Kakashi said, his pronounced frown showing through the black material of his face mask. The expression was quickly morphing to surprise. Those are parts of a seal. He looked up to Minato for confirmation, though the Hokage could see his former student didn't really need it. Minato nodded as Tsunade's and Rin's face lit with the same recognition. A seal for what? Rin asked, now peering at the drawing with greater intensity as her eyes ran over the out-of-place markers. There's no way to tell without the complete seal, Jiraiya said, taking back the drawings. We'll try to piece it together as much as possible, see what we can figure out from the sections we have, but there's no way to tell for sure if these are even from the same seal. Minato nodded in agreement. And any that we manage to string together will merely be speculation on our parts. The only way we'll know we have the right seal is by trying it, and unless we somehow find the hand seals for it, that won't be possible. He cleared his throat, thinking he might be sounding a little too pessimistic. But we'll try, Minato finished to an amused snort for Jiraiya. Yes, we'll try, Jiraiya agreed, tucking the pictures away and crossing his arms. He tilted his head and a light tone came into his voice. And we'll work it out, too, because I'm the best seal master around. And Minato-kun is alright. He finished with a hand waggle and a shrug. Minato purposely ignored the friendly jab, not wanting to encourage his sensei any farther. Unfortunately, even if we do find the right seal, that will hardly answer all of our questions. Have you considered attempting to contact the Sandaime again? Tsunade asked, equally ignoring Jiraiya. Nodding, Minato held back a sigh as he agreed. I think that's the only way that we'll really be able to find out what happened. Naruto certainly doesn't know anything, and what he does know he doesn't understand enough to communicate reliably. We could try tonight, after Naruto-kun is in bed, Kakashi suggested. You both always kept late hours anyway. Minato thought that over for a moment before he nodded. I want you and Rin to stay and keep an eye on Naruto, though. Nobody should know he's here, but just in case. Rin bobbed her head and Kakashi responded with, Hi, Hokage-sama. His voice didn't betray any disappointment at being left out from the meeting or enthusiasm for spending time with Naruto. How are you going to explain his presence? Tsunade asked, a skeptical look in her eye. Do you plan on just sending him back to his own world and all is said and done? The other Konoha may not give up their Jinchuriki so easily, and they have means of coming into our world while have no idea how to even attempt crossing to theirs. That gives them a distinct advantage if a fight were to break out. Minato shifted where he stood, resisting the urge to run a hand over his face. Still, he couldn't help the cooling of his tone and hardening of his face when he replied. I think we have other problems to take care of before we approach that. No need borrowing trouble, Jiraiya agreed quietly. XXXXX Jiraiya frowned at the papers scattered around him. They covered his bed in the second-floor room at the Hokage's mansion and spilled onto the floor. At a casual glance, the papers didn't look like anything more than a collection of children's scribbles strewn randomly over the bedspread, but the drawings were laid out in a careful order based on the partial seal found in Naruto's pictures. The newer drawings Naruto had finished while the adults were talking sat on the floor. There were no buried seals in them. Jiraiya guessed it was due to Naruto's concentration and focus while he drew them. In the earlier doodles, the boy hadn't been paying attention and that most likely allowed whatever was buried in his head to leach through to the casual drawings. In the new drawings, Naruto had clearly tried to make the nicest pictures he was able. Touching, but for the purpose they had set the boy to draw, ultimately useless. Perhaps Minato could tack them to a wall somewhere in the house. Luckily, there was enough to work with in the other drawings for the moment. Based on those fragments, Jiraiya thought he recognized some of the work from his old sensei. Considering Naruto's likely close proximity and relationship with the Sandaime, it certainly would make sense to find Sarutobi Sensei's seal in the boy's head. Still, it did nothing to explain why the seal was there in the first place. Undoubtedly, if he knew what the seal did, he would know why it was buried in Naruto, or have a very good guess at the very least. A sudden bout of laughter sounded through the door, followed by a rush of feet down the hall and stairs. Jiraiya looked up to the closed door and smiled, causing crow's feet to appear at the corners of his eyes. It had been a long time since he'd heard laughter in this house and he was grateful for that if nothing else. The smile faded though as his eyes slid down to the scroll opened across his lap. It was the seal Minato found on Naruto's stomach. It was very similar to a seal Minato had worked on years ago, but as the Hokage said, there were several important modifications to it that were never made in their world. Originally, Minato had planned to go over the two versions of the seal in detail on his own, but with Naruto always around, the new father was understandably distracted, so he gave Jiraiya both variations of the seal to examine and compare in addition to the drawings. The original lay to the side, spread out on its own scroll, ready for quick reference when needed. Downstairs, the front door opened and closed, leaving the house suddenly quiet, breaking Jiraiya's tenuous concentration for a moment. They would have to come up with an explanation for Naruto or be prepared to tell the truth soon, otherwise the boy would have to be confined to the immediate area around the house for a long time. Trusting that Minato wouldn't let Naruto stray too far from the house, Jiraiya refocused on the seal, taking advantage of the quiet while he had it. He thought he had all of the modifications figured out, especially when compared to the original seal. The majority of them focused on recycling chakra through the host, most likely to allow Naruto to use the fox's chakra if he needed it. The amount of bleed-off allowed seemed much greater than the few other Jinchuriki seals he'd seen in his life. However, there was something that bothered him. It wasn't the seal itself. He couldn't find any theoretical problem with the construction of the seal. Sometimes seals had side effects that weren't and couldn't be predicted until they were used, especially if they were new and untested. Naruto's seal was further complicated by the Kyuubi's chakra. The demon fox's chakra was corrosive, for lack of a better word. Jiraiya was unsure what results would come from allowing the Kyuubi's chakra to filter out of the seal over an extended period of time. Would it make the seal weaken? It was difficult to say, but something about the entire setup made him uneasy. Gazing out the window, Jiraiya frowned as he let his mind turn back to Kushina and how she had dealt with the Kyuubi all those years. He didn't often think about Kushina in depth. He preferred not to consider her tragic end and its impact on his pupil, but now his thoughts sifted through everything he could remember. Her seal had been different than Naruto's. It focused mainly on suppressing the Kyuubi as much as possible, to keep it locked away from the world and anyone who would manipulate it for their own purposes. Naruto's seemed designed with the intention that the boy would one day use the Kyuubi's power as freely as his own. Kushina's seal had also depended a great deal on her unique chakra. Jiraiya still didn't know much about Naruto's chakra, perhaps it also had a unique resistance to the Kyuubi's own. The Sannin had a hard time believing it didn't, considering the boy had lived with the Kyuubi his entire life and potentially inherited his mother's ability. Still, Naruto was only 8 and barely had any control of his own chakra. It would be difficult to verify the hypothesis. Sighing in frustration, Jiraiya turned back to the unknown seal spread out around him. He'd been going between the two for the past hour, constantly running into the same issues. There simply wasn't enough information. The mystery seal was incomplete and he didn't have the heart to interrupt Minato and Naruto's fun. Eventually, they'd have to take a closer look at Naruto's chakra with its reaction to the Kyuubi's. They also would have to check if there was another way to access the seal buried inside the boy's head and check on the other chakra Tsunade had detected, but that could wait for the moment. Below on the first floor, Jiraiya could hear Naruto's happy voice rising and falling, offsetting Minato's more muted replies. They sounded like they were in the kitchen. Jiraiya dearly hoped Minato wasn't attempting to cook anything or show Naruto how to cook. Jiraiya cringed as he heard the loud clatter of pots topple to the floor. He could imagine Minato in the kitchen with Naruto right now with delusions of a home-cooked dinner. If worse came to worse, they could always order out for something. Determined to distract himself and find a solution to at least one of the mysteries before him, Jiraiya pulled out a new scroll. If he copied over the disparate sections of the unknown seal, perhaps he could find the most likely connections for them. There was still some time before dinner, not including the time to order takeout if Minato's attempts at cooking downstairs went astray. Then, if he so chose, he'd have a few hours to work on it some more after dinner and before they put Naruto to bed and headed over to the Hokage Tower. Jiraiya reasoned he'd be able to work out some of the possible connections between the different sections during that time. It would all be conjecture, but it was better than nothing. XXXXX Naruto was having the nightmare again. It was different from the first night spent in the new world. That nightmare had been a memory, and while some distant part of his brain realized that this nightmare was only that, the fear that filled him almost worse than the memory itself. The setting was still the same and the beginning of the attack remained unchanged, but this time the ANBU never came to save him. One moment, he was being chased by nameless enemy Shinobi. Then he turned to find a mob of angry villagers after him. They chased after him for somehow causing the attack that was still happening around them. Everywhere buildings burned and no matter where Naruto turned down the streets and alleyways he couldn't escape. The worst, however, wasn't the villagers' screams of terror or their cries of rage. It wasn't the growing sounds of battle and chaos that gripped Konoha. It wasn't even the mobs or the enemy Shinobi that occasionally caught up to Naruto. The most terrifying part, the very worst part of his dream, was the red mist. It followed him wherever he went, skirting the edge of the street when the villagers and Shinobi were there, then closing in when he was alone. It licked against his arms and legs, burning and scorching against his skin. Naruto could feel the malice and anger that filled the red mist, as well as the power. It terrified him. Running, Naruto fled more from the mist than people chasing him. He flailed against it when it crept in close and cornered him, but there was no way to fight it. It reached out toward him and licked against his skin. As time passed, it seemed to grow until he could feel it grabbing at his arms. He cried out in desperation, hoping the villagers would find him if only their presence would keep it at bay. "Shoo. It's all right, I'm right here." The voice jolted Naruto awake, making him twist and jerk away from the restraints. It was a moment later when he realized the restraints weren't the red mist closing in or the villagers holding him down. They were a pair of arms, gently but firmly wrapped around him. Naruto stopped his struggle if for no other reason than surprise, and he caught the stream of words above him. "You're fine, you're safe here. I won't let anything happen to you." It was Minato. The Hokage had his arms wrapped around Naruto and had pulled him into a hug, supporting Naruto's top half in his lap. The shock and lingering desperation from the dream kept Naruto from tensing at the close contact, and instead he turned his face and shoulders into the man's stomach. Minato's arms tightened around Naruto's shoulders and pulled him up farther into the man's lap. Unable to make himself hug the man back, Naruto pulled his arms into his own chest but pressed himself against the reassuring presence beside him. Minato responded by squeezing Naruto tighter, rocking them both back and forth while he kept up his reassuring litany. Naruto's breath hitched, but he refused to cry. Instead, he squeezed his eyes shut and focused on pushing back the shaky feeling left from the dream. It sent tremors down his limbs and made his breath shudder as he tried to draw air past whatever was blocking his throat. The gentle rocking motion didn't seem to help at first, either. Initially it just made him want to cry all the more, but eventually the slow steady motion eased the knot in Naruto's chest. For a few moments, Naruto reveled in the security and comfort of the embrace, even as another part of him floundered at the unfamiliarity of it all. Slowly the rocking stopped and Minato paused a moment before asking, "Better?" Unwilling to look up, partially from embarrassment, Naruto just nodded into the Hokage's chest. Neither one moved from their position as Minato waited another breath. "Do you want to talk about it?" Naruto slowly shook his head, more from impulse than actual response to the question. He didn't want to talk about it in any case, didn't want to have to explain to Minato that the villagers had always hated him, that he'd always been alone. If Minato found out, who was to say he wouldn't change his mind about Naruto, too? "Are you sure?" Minato asked, pulling back to look down, craning his neck to peer into Naruto's face. "Talking about it helps." Naruto thought about it again. He'd never tried talking about his nightmares to anyone before, unless you counted when he told Minato and Jiraiya about his dream memory 2 days before, and he hadn't had any nightmares that following night. Normally, he'd be ecstatic to have someone to talk to about anything, but the awkwardness of the situation was seeping in now that the first few panicked moments of waking were past. He suddenly felt nervous even as drowsiness tugged at his eyes. If he had to guess, he'd say Minato was also feeling a little awkward from the way the man shifted in his seat as the quiet minutes slipped by and neither spoke. With one more silent shake of his head, Naruto crawled out of Minato's arms and back under the covers. The night was chilly and he burrowed down into the heavy blankets with relish. The bed here was nice and soft, even if it smelt a little like dust and made his nose twitch at first. It was much better than what he had at his old apartment with his used and sagging mattress and thin blankets. Minato pulled the blankets up a little higher until only Naruto's face and mop of hair poked out. The gesture helped settle the last of Naruto's nerves brought on by the nightmare and he relaxed back into bed, ready to fall back asleep. "If you change your mind, I'll be more than willing to listen," Minato said, resting a hand on Naruto's shoulder through the blankets. Naruto nodded again, eyes blinking heavily. The gesture was nice even if he didn't plan to take up the offer. "I have to go take care of something back at the Hokage Tower, but Kakashi will be here if you need anything, all right?" Another partial nod was all Naruto could manage before the heavy warmth surrounding him pulled him into sleep. XXXXX Minato adjusted the covers over Naruto, glad he had delayed leaving the house immediately after putting Naruto to bed that night. It still was relatively early in the night and he didn't usually talk with the Sandaime until much later, so there was no rush to leave immediately. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his son's chest as Naruto sank deeper into sleep and hopefully better dreams. Minutes passed and Minato didn't move, burning the image into his memory. If things went wrong and something happened to prevent Naruto from staying, he wanted to have as many memories from these moments as possible. They would be painful to look back on, but it would be better than never having them, he was sure. Time stretched and Minato didn't know how long he sat there, enjoying the quiet with only Naruto's soft breathing to break the silence. A shadow cut across the light streaming in from the lit hallway. He didn't have to look up to recognize the outline of his sensei sketched out on the floor. "Everything all right?" Jiraiya asked from his position leaning against the door frame, arms crossed. Minato could hear the other questions hidden inside the first. The older man was asking about Minato, himself, just as much as about Naruto. "Yeah," Minato breathed, rubbing his hands over his thighs before pushing up to his feet. "I've just been making sure he got back to sleep without trouble." Jiraiya's tone was level and his face was cast in shadow with the hall light behind him, so Minato couldn't see any more than an outline. "Kakashi will be here in case there are any problems." "I know, I just want to be sure." Rising slowly to his feet, Minato took one last look at his son before silently retreating from the room. He closed the door behind him with slow, careful movements. "He wouldn't tell me about his nightmare." The disappointment was more evident in his voice than he had originally wanted. Jiraiya shrugged, guiding the Hokage back down the hall to the staircase. "What do you expect? This is still new to the kid, you're still new to the kid. It's gonna take time." When Minato didn't respond right away, Jiraiya sighed and patted his shoulder, repeating in a sympathetic voice. "Just give it some time." "And if I don't have that time?" Minato countered with a frown. He shook his head, picking up his pace and sparing his sensei from replying. At the bottom of the staircase, Kakashi slouched against the wall, his one eye trained on the two men coming down from the second floor. Rin stood nearby, looking at a landscape hanging on the wall with false interest. At their footsteps on the stairs she turned around and watched them. "How's he doing?" Rin asked, moving to the base of the staircase across from Kakashi. It sounded like he was pretty upset. "Nightmare," Minato responded, thankful for Rin's concern and glad she had invited herself along for guard duty with Kakashi. She had a full schedule with her duties as a medical nin and he hadn't wanted to put any additional requirements on her at first, but she'd shown up with Kakashi a few hours after the two had left Naruto's medical examination. "He's asleep again and hopefully he won't have any other problems through the rest of the night." "Don't worry, Sensei," Rin smiled, "we'll look after him." Minato nodded, hesitating at the door. He knew his two remaining students would protect Naruto with their lives if necessary and Rin could more than handle another nightmare, but he still searched for a reason to delay a little longer. Beside him, Jiraiya let out an exasperated sigh, slapped him on the shoulder, and pushed him to the door. "We'll be back, probably late," Jiraiya called behind them as they moved out to the dimly lit front walk. The door closed behind them, cutting off the bright light from the front hall. Minato suppressed rolling his eyes at his sensei at being pushed out the door, but he couldn't blame the man. If everything went well, Jiraiya would be able to see his sensei for the first time in years. If Minato had been in his shoes he too would be understandably eager. So without looking back, Minato sped up his pace and turned down the road. He leapt up onto a small wooden stand and pushed off to travel over the rooftops, Jiraiya close behind him. Tsunade was waiting for them at the front door of the tower. She tapped her foot as she stood under the entrance lights, arms crossed and mild frown on her face. "About time," she grumbled when they landed on the steps in front of her. "Something came up," Minato said, but the medic didn't wait to listen to him, flipping her hand and turning to move inside. "If you say so," she said, pulling open the doors only to pause just inside the building. So where is it? It's in the lower levels, Minato said once he and Jiraiya were also inside and the door closed. Nodding, Tsunade fell in step behind Minato as he set off to the stairwell. The lights were dimmed due to the late hour and the hall's quiet. In a few offices, the lamps were turned for the few working late. They quickly passed through the hall and down the stairs. The lower levels were lit with the same low light and sounded as quiet as they did at any other time of day. No one spoke until they arrived to the door and Minato ran through the long sequence of hand signs to grant them access. Minutes passed as he carefully deactivated every security measure. By the time he was done, his arms were fatigued and Tsunade's eyebrows had risen toward her blonde hair. "Well, at least you're not taking any chances about security," she commented dryly, arms once again crossed before her. "Some of those I added after I found Naruto," Minato admitted. "I didn't think there was any possible way to travel through it, but since being proven otherwise I've increased the security I already had in place." "Like that guard I noticed," Tsunade said as they moved into the room. Minato merely nodded, unsurprised that she had noticed the ANBU he had placed to guard the door at all times. The inside of the room was mostly the same as they had last left it. Thankfully, the stain that marred the floor had been cleaned up. Minato hadn't done it, or allowed anyone into the room to do it, so it must have been Jiraiya, the only other seal master in the village adept enough to deactivate the complicated security seals without setting off the alarms. Jiraiya had also been the one to reseal the room last, when they had mistakenly brought Naruto down to bring forth some of his memories. "You may want to place a guard inside the room itself," Tsunade said, her voice half distracted as she looked at the mirror standing in the center of the room. "Better to stop them from getting through at all than letting into here, even if it's only into this one room. We don't know their abilities, after all. They may be more skilled than we expected." Tilting his head to the side in partial acknowledgement, Minato thought about the idea. "I've considered it. That would mean giving more than just Minato and myself access to the room," Jiraiya said with his own frown. "Do we want more people able to gain access?" "That's what I'm wondering," Minato admitted. He gave Tsunade a few minutes to look over the mirror before motioning that she should move to the side. Stepping up in front of the chakra glass, he felt suddenly nervous about opening up the window. He didn't know what he would find on the other side, but a part of him strongly doubted it would be his predecessor. Taking a breath and calming his nerves, Minato ran through the long string of hand seals to unlock and open the mirror. A light flashed across the glassy surface before it settled to show the room beyond Minato's world. He frowned as he looked into the other place. There was a figure on the other side of the mirror, but it was not the Sandaime. The seal breakers, after working tirelessly day and night, had finally broken through the many protections surrounding the hidden door in the Hokage Tower. A few of them had been injured and even died in the effort of dismantling the traps laid by the Sandaime Hokage, but Pain was certain it was worth the sacrifice of time and men. He wasn't sure what he would find when he went through the door. He didn't allow anyone else into the room before him, but his face displayed no reaction to the almost empty room uncovered by their efforts. Pain didn't have long to examine the room before a barrage of kunai burst from the walls immediately flanking the door. He pushed the attack away before having to dodge the second volley following too soon after the first. As soon as he landed, a series of explosive tags appeared on the wall closest to him, and he pushed the explosion back on itself, creating a large smoking crater in one side of the room. Moments passed as Pain stood ready for another attack. The dust settled from the explosion and still nothing happened. Slowly, he straightened, shifting his weight as he judged the likelihood of the existence of more traps. When still nothing happened, he relaxed and took a better look around the room. A quick check of the rest of the room showed no other exits besides the door Pain had entered. A thin layer of debris spread across the once clean space, but the tall blank mirror in the center was left undamaged. A quick analysis of the traps and their pattern led Pain to believe the mirror had been specifically left out of harm's way when the traps were first set. Pain slowly moved to the mirror, examining the smooth black crystal surface. He could see with his Rinnegan that an immense amount of chakra flowed through the crystal glass, but it seemed dormant, inactive. Walking around the object, he could see it was made of chakra crystal, but more than that was difficult to determine. There were no indications what it did or how it worked, no seals, carvings, or symbols. Conan entered the room behind him, though all others stayed away by express order. She didn't say anything, letting Pain decide on how or when or if to open the conversation as she so often did. Several minutes of silence passed before Pain spoke. "There is no other way out of this room," he stated as he trailed a finger down the surface of the glass, checking the reaction to chakra. His reflection stared back at him, dulled by the dusty surface and dim light in the room. There was another moment of silence before Conan replied. In the glass, Pain could see her dark outline, the brighter hallway behind her shining through the ruined doorway. "The IWA forces are retreating," she said in a level tone, giving no emotion away. "We have been able to mostly repel all attacks, but only because of our informant, and the Konoha shinobi have been splitting themselves between our lines and Iwa's. Konoha was not expected to still have as many high-ranking shinobi left after the initial assault. This long drawn-out battle in the streets is not to our advantage." It was the most she had said at once in a while, perhaps months or even longer. Her reflection didn't move as she spoke, and Pain's eyes didn't waver from it as he stopped with one hand pressed to the glass. "We had two objectives in coming here," Pain started, though he knew she was well aware of both, his eyes raking across the crystal glass before him. "The first was to neutralize Konoha's power so as to eliminate any obstruction they present to our plans, with the added benefit of cutting down Iwa's military at the same time. The second was to acquire the Kyubi before the container learned to wield its power. If the Jinchuriki ever learned to master the Kyubi's power, it could become problematic." Pain continued. To move around the mirror, hand trailing over the surface and drawing smooth paths in the dust-covered surface. "The Kyubi was brought to this level, most likely to this room, but there are no other escape routes from here. It must have something to do with this mirror." Conan moved closer, examining the mirror with new interest. "Could we take it with us if we were forced to retreat?" she asked, though her tone didn't seem to expect an answer. "Do you believe our situation to be that dire?" Pain returned, only half listening for her answer as he crouched down in the back. "Konoha could not stand against us if you used your full strength," the kunoichi responded with indifference, "but you have already stated you do not wish to show your full strength to the world, yet. Better to leave them floundering and blaming IWA," Pain agreed. However, that meant they could very well be pushed out of their stronghold if the tides of battle shifted. Neither said it, but both understood very well the dangers of limiting their strength in the battle. "Our objectives concerning Konoha have been met. It will take the city time to recover from this, and the added instability of relations with IWA will only work in our favor if we are pushed from the city. Our new focus is to find the Kyubi and secure it." Silence fell again as Pain finished his examination of the mirror. Standing, he moved toward the door. They would have to find other sources of information concerning the device. It would be next to impossible to understand in the short time they had without additional reference. Conan fell into step close behind, her footsteps quiet echoes of his own. They were almost to the door, about to leave, when a faint noise came from behind and light suddenly flooded into the room, adding to the few torches that remained standing. Pain turned back, looking with Conan at the mirror in renewed interest. Instead of a blank, dark surface, the mirror reflected a different, brighter room, and staring back at them were several new figures. "Who are you?" the first and central figure, a blond man, demanded. His face had quickly transformed from shock to hardened focus as his distinctive blue eyes took in both Pain and Conan. Behind the blonde stood Jiraiya-sensei and Tsunade, also of the Sannin. Pain took his time making his observations, letting the question hang unanswered in the air. "You are the Yondaime Hokage," he finally said, choosing to ignore the opening question altogether. He recognized the deceased man from photographs he had seen and was careful to keep any surprise he felt at the unexpected appearance at bay. Yahiko? Conan? Jiraiya gasped in shock as Tsunade muttered, "That kid," under her breath. Jiraiya sensei, Pain acknowledged, but the bulk of his attention was drawn to the mirror itself. Now that it was activated, chakra flowed freely through the crystal, marking out patterns and directions. If he could make sense of the flow, it would bring them that much closer to understanding the device and what had happened to the Kyuubi. Though, his initial guess was the vessel was sent to wherever he was currently seeing. Jiraiya's voice distracted his attention for a moment as his old sensei barked, "Quickly, Minato. He's using his Rinnegan to observe the chakra flow." The Hokage glanced at Jiraiya with a surprised frown before quickly running through hand signs at an incredible speed. The mirror went blank in the middle of the sequence, cutting off any chance of seeing the completed set and plunging the room into half-light again. Silence reigned, made more prominent by the contrast of light and sound that had briefly entered the room. Pain continued to watch the mirror as the last rift of chakra ran through it, only speaking when the crystal was completely still again. Interesting. XXXXX Minato continued to stare at the mirror long after it had gone dark. In his mind's eye, he could still see the red-headed man and his companion that stood on the other side. He ran over the image several times, ensuring he committed it to memory even as he desperately tried to understand what they had been doing in that room. They had both worn the same cloak, implying some kind of organization. Their headbands had been from Amigakure, but there was a slash through the markings which meant they were most likely rogue ninjas, probably part of the invasion force that had attacked Naruto's Konoha. The most startling thing, though, had been the man's eyes. "Oh boy," Jiraiya sighed behind him, drawing Minato out of his spinning thoughts. Things just became much more complicated. "What do you mean, sensei?" Minato asked, finally turning from the mirror and facing the older man. "Who was that? You seem to know him." Jiraiya nodded, a worried and puzzled frown on his face. "I do, or I did. He was one of my students around the time of the Second Shinobi War, before I took on your training." "Two of those orphans," Tsunade said, a scowl on her face as she looked from the mirror back to her old teammate, "but I thought you said they had all died." "That's what I believed, too," Jiraiya murmured, his voice dropping in thought, "but that happened before our two worlds supposedly split." "So who was he?" Minato repeated. They could discover the mystery on how the man had survived later. The more pressing issue was that the other mirror had apparently fallen into enemy hands. "During the Second Shinobi War we came across 3 orphans not long after our battle with Hanzo. They followed us and asked us to train them. I decided to stay with them for a while and teach them ninjutsu until they could look after themselves. Yahiko, Nagato, and Conan." Jiraiya's eyes misted over as he gazed back into the past memories. They were talented, all 3 of them, but Nagato. He had the Rinnegan. "The Rinnegan?" Minato repeated, torn between shock and disbelief. "That's supposed to be a myth, but he was talking more out of reaction. He'd seen the ripple pattern of the man's eyes and it matched the stories he'd heard about the legendary dojutsu. Plus, Jiraiya wasn't one to exaggerate about things like this. If his old sensei said it was the Rinnegan, chances were it was." Jiraiya only shrugged. "All myth is based in fact. Nagato had the Rinnegan. For a while I thought he was the child of prophecy I'd been told about, but then I heard that all 3 of those kids were killed, so I assumed I was wrong. Perhaps you should check up on them again, see if they really did die," Tsunade said, worried frown on her face. "Like you said, they died before the 2 timelines began to differ, as far as we know. I'd rather not be surprised by someone like that." Minato glanced back to the mirror, picturing the man on the other side. Anyone with the Rinnegan could be dangerous, separated by dimensions or not. He turned and moved toward the door, calling one of the ANBU guards to his side. "I want a guard inside the chamber at all times, as well." Under no circumstances is that room to be left unwatched. "Hi, Hokage-sama," the guard said before he disappeared. Jiraiya and Tsunade followed him out into the hallway. They only had to wait a moment before the ANBU with the additional guard returned. The additional guard slipped into the room, disappearing into the shadows. Minato turned to the ANBU captain. "I'm going to seal the room again. There's no way out from the inside, so watch closely. You'll be the only one besides myself and Jiraiya-sensei who is authorized to open this door." The ANBU captain nodded and Minato ran through the hand seals, sealing the room with the mirror and guard inside. Then, leaving the guards to their work, Minato turned back down the hall. They're almost certainly after the Kyuubi inside Naruto. There wouldn't be any other reason to worry about the mirror, unless they were just in there by coincidence when we activated the device, Jiraiya agreed, speeding up his pace to match Minato's. Glancing to his former teacher, Minato said, "I need to know everything you knew about those 3 children. The information may be old, but at least it's something." Jiraiya nodded. "I'll go over their abilities and what I taught them before I leave for Amigakure. It's time I double-checked just what happened to those 3 in our own world. I'll go through our records to see if we have anything on the Rinnegan itself. It probably won't be more than rumors and legend, but anything is better than nothing," Tsunade said, crossing her arms in front of her. "Thank you, Tsunade-sama. I have a feeling we can't be too prepared for whatever comes our way." XXXXX Kakashi let his eyes slide over the room even as he let his ears strain to hear into the corridor beside him. He had positioned himself so he could monitor both, choosing this particular break room because it was the closest to the intelligence division. With much of the village in rumble, behind, or to near enemy lines, they had been forced to make do with the little space they had, setting up emergency facilities and relocating departments where they could. After looking at the most suspicious reports indicating a leak, the Kopinin had determined the intel division closest to the Hokage's makeshift office the most likely housing a leak. He was making several assumptions by doing so: if the spy didn't act on every piece of intel they came across, had more connections than he realized, or some of the suspicious activities were simply coincidences, then he could very well be in the wrong area. He'd already informed the Hokage and they'd begun subtly rechanneling vital information around the specific office to other divisions for processing. If he was wrong and the spy wasn't located in that subdivision, they could very well be aiding the spy in gaining more intel. Still, this was Kakashi's best starting point, and it would be the perfect place for a spy to position themselves, not too high up to be found easily, but not completely out of the loop, which was why Kakashi was slowly waiting to see or hear anything that would give him any more clues. He had a list of suspects, but it was barely shorter than the number of people working or in contact with the intel office in question. He couldn't risk moving before he was sure and possibly miss his chance to capture the spy. The culprit would undoubtedly have valuable information that could prove vital to reclaiming the rest of the village. If nothing else, they could find out exactly what information had been compromised and change their plans accordingly. A door slammed shut, making Kakashi twitch where he sat slouch against the wall. He had started to doze off without realizing it. In all honesty, he was probably too tired from the day's constant fighting to be conducting the delicate type of surveillance work he was attempting, but he had no choice. Times were desperate. Silently berating himself for letting fatigue get the better of him, he tried to shift and stretch as much he could without drawing attention. He'd been working on the problem of the spy for over 48 hours and only a few cat naps during that time. He needed a rest before he made a mistake to give himself away, but was reluctant at giving up with such an important mission on his shoulders. The room slowly emptied out as people headed back to their post, muttering and shuffling tiredly as they left. Only a few exhausted people remained, napping on blanket folded on the floor. Several of the remainders were people on his short list of suspects, so Kakashi remained where he was, eyeing each in turn. Footsteps behind him in the hall caught his attention and Kakashi turned his focus to listening to the passers. They came from the direction of the intel office in question, and he tuned his ears to listen to the muffled voices. Almost 19 hours without a break, one female voice complained. Kakashi thought he vaguely recognized it but couldn't put a face to the voice. I can't wait for this nightmare to be over. We can only do our best in a situation like this, another male voice sighed, sounding resigned. Everyone's working overtime now. Not Q, he's been taking breaks at the oddest times, the first voice complained, muttering lower than before. Thankfully the pair were drawing closer to the break room and Kakashi could still hear despite the drop in volume. I turned around the other day to get his opinion on something and he wasn't there. No word or anything, just gone. Geez, he's so inconsiderate. Kakashi's ears perked up just a little bit, though he didn't let his interest show even to the near-empty room. Q stays late to work, too, and things are so crazy now everyone is running around. Even our department's been split up between different offices and floors. He could be running around to the different offices like I was doing half the day. The last few words were forced through a yawn that carried on past the statement. The kunoichi just huffed in disbelief, but didn't respond. Their footsteps were moving down the hallway away from where Kakashi sat in the break room. Sporadic disappearances, huh? Kakashi mused to himself. An erratic break schedule was hardly proof. It was barely evidence considering how everything had been thrown out of balance since the attack began, but Kakashi didn't have much else to go on and his gut told him to look closer. Ignoring the stiffness that had settled into his limbs from hours on the floor, Kakashi pushed himself to his feet. He'd make a report to the Hokage to go check up on this Q person. XXXXX, Naruto-kun, are you alright? Naruto twitched at the sudden sound, but didn't answer. With his back turned toward the door he stared at the two shadows thrown by the hall light against the wall. He recognized Rin's voice and could tell the other was Kakashi from the man's wild hair. We know you're awake, Rin's voice was gentle as she came over to the bedside. Did you have another nightmare? Still not answering, Naruto rolled over and looked to the door, blinking in the bright light that streamed into the room. Rin was standing next to the bed, bending over as she looked down at him. By the door Kakashi leaned against the frame, using the light from the hall to read from a book. Shifting his eyes back to Rin, Naruto tried not to fidget as she drew his blanket back up to his chin from where it had fallen. He didn't like people towering over him. It happened often enough, considering how short he was, and he was used to it when he was up on his feet. Then, at least he could fight or run away if he needed to, but lying down like he was at that moment made him feel much more vulnerable. He shifted again, pulling the blanket up farther over his face. Rin glanced back to Kakashi. The hall light momentarily lit the uncertain look on her face before she turned back and her expression was hidden in shadow. Again. She stepped back to the foot of the bed before slowly sitting down on the mattress edge. Naruto unconsciously relaxed at the added space between them. We thought we heard you having a nightmare, Rin said, her voice even more gentle than before, if that were possible, as if she expected him to break if she spoke too loud. The silence stretched as Naruto stared at her. He wasn't sure what to say. Earlier, when Minato had woken him from the nightmare he'd almost cried into the man's shoulder and taken his comfort, but he'd been caught off guard after suddenly waking up. Normally, he wouldn't do that for anyone, or perhaps it was because he'd never before had the chance. He wasn't sure and it was becoming more confusing as time passed. There was also something different about Minato. Maybe it was the fact that the Hokage was the first person he'd met in the new world and had taken care of him or being with his longtime hero in the flesh, but Naruto felt safe with him. It wasn't quite the same as being with the Sandaime, but it wasn't completely different, either. It made Minato seem less like a stranger even though they'd only just met days ago. These two that he'd been left with, though. I'm fine, Naruto finally said, aware that both adults were still waiting for an answer. He'd dealt with nightmares alone before, and he could do it again. Talking about it helps, you know, Kakashi said, sounding bored but echoing the same thing Minato had said earlier. He held his book in front of him, but he was watching Naruto with a sidelong glance, head tilted slightly toward the bed. Dredging up a smile, Naruto shook his head. "No, it's all right. I'm fine." Even with a shadow covering her face, Naruto could tell Rin was frowning. He could hear it in her voice. "Well, that if you need anything, just call us. We'll be right here." She stood from the bed, smoothing the covers briefly before moving to the door. She stepped past Kakashi into the hall. Kakashi looked up properly from his book and reached for the door. "Do you want us to send Minato-sensei up when he returns? He should be back shortly." Naruto shook his head. Part of him liked the idea of Minato coming up again, but another part, accustomed to sleeping alone in an apartment for the last several years, resisted. Kakashi shrugged and started pulling the door closed, but Naruto stopped him. "Don't close it all the way," he said quickly. The ANBU glanced at him before shrugging again and leaving the door open a crack. Kakashi disappeared down the hall, his and Rin's footsteps padding quietly toward the stairs mixed with their hushed whispers. Naruto listened to them move away, relaxing into the bed again. He pulled the covers tighter around himself and shifted around to a more comfortable position, though he wasn't planning on going to sleep any time soon. It had been the same dream again, with the attack, the mob, and the red mist. The fear stayed with him even when he was awake, and he didn't want to risk plunging back into the center of it by going back to sleep right away. The attack was frightening. He'd never been in a battle before, and though all his classmates played at fighting in shinobi battles and wars, the prospect of a real one with its uncertainty was more nerve-wracking than he thought it would be. The mob was a scene he was too familiar with not to fear. He'd been in situations similar to that, if not as bad, and he knew exactly what could happen if it were real. The truly terrifying this about the dream, though, was the red mist. Sitting in his bed, Naruto knew the mob wouldn't attack him. The people in this village weren't angry at him at all, and no one knew he was there in any case. He didn't think his luck was bad enough to have 2 Konohas attacked within a week. Plus, there were 2 guards just downstairs who seemed willing to defend or help him if they were needed. The red mist Naruto had never encountered or even heard of before, but he couldn't shake off the feeling it gave him. It was like it was following him out of his dreams and into the waking world, hanging just out of sight. Looking around, Naruto scanned the corners of the room, half expecting to see it there, hanging like it had in the dream. The room was empty though, free of any mist, red or otherwise. The light from the hall certainly helped, Naruto thought as he settled back staring at his narrow view into the hall. He could almost feel the phantom malice still hanging around the darkest corners of the room. It reminded him of his first few nights in his apartment, huddled in bed and frightened of his new surroundings. It almost made him change his mind about Minato coming up again. Almost. Naruto resisted the impulse, though. Perhaps it was out of habit, but he couldn't imagine himself calling for help for nothing more than a dream. He'd been dealing with bad dreams and worse on his own for years, and a part of him couldn't help but wonder when he'd have to go back to that. The last several days with Minato and the growing group of people he'd encountered was nice, but no one had ever stayed in his life for long. It was only a matter of time before they grew tired of him or left for whatever reason. Maybe they would just send him back to his own village. In the back of his head, Naruto felt a faint itch at the thought. Whatever happened, Naruto couldn't imagine any of them being there permanently, which meant he couldn't let himself get too attached. He liked being here with everyone. For the first time, it felt like he was a part of a family like the ones he saw his classmates with back home. Having this glimpse and losing it would be painful enough without getting more involved. Besides, Naruto told himself, the Hokage would have more important things to do than sit by his bedside all night. With that last thought, he curled his knees into his chest and prepared for the long wait till dawn. XXXXX, Naruto-kun. Breakfast. The call. startled Naruto awake, making him tumbled from his bed to the floor in a heap of blankets. Slowly righting himself, he rubbed the growing bump on his head where he'd hit the floor. Too early, he grumbled to himself as he looked around the sunlit room blearily. He must have fallen asleep at some point after Rin and Kakashi left. "Naruto-kun," the voice was coming from the bottom of the stairs now. "I'm comin'." Naruto yelled back, still rubbing his eye as he stifled another yawn. "Hurry up before it gets cold." Naruto pushed himself to his feet, still moaning from being woken up. Yeah. He shuffled down the hall and stairs, still yawning and scratching his head. He didn't need to see himself in the hall mirror to know his hair was sticking up all over. He hitched up the pajama pants Minato had gotten him before pushing open the swinging door and dragging himself into the kitchen. "Good morning, Naruto-kun," Minato chuckled, making Naruto blink up at his surroundings. Minato sat at the table dressed in his blue ninja uniform, a large coffee mug steaming in front of him. He was smiling down at Naruto with a wide grin and amusement lighting his eyes. Rin stood at the stove, apron around her waist and spatula in hand. A frying pan with pancakes cooking was on the burner next to her. "Food?" Naruto asked, immediately perking up at the sounds and smells of cooking coming from the pan. "Can I have ramen today?" "That's hardly breakfast," Rin said, flipping over a pancake once more before adding it to a plate next to her. She poured more batter into the pan, causing a new round of sizzling to fill the room. "But I like ramen," Naruto complained. He pulled out another chair at the table, glancing only briefly at several burnt and oily pancakes in the trash by the door. That explained the faint burning smell that vaguely hung in the room. Rin noticed the glance and snorted. "Minato-sensei started the pancakes. I had to step in if we wanted anything eatable for breakfast. The first few are always burnt," Minato muttered, sliding down in his seat as he brought up his mug. "You always liked my cooking out in the field." "Not much you can do to make field rations worse, sensei," Rin replied as she placed a plate down in front of Naruto. Naruto eyed the steaming pancakes with equal parts hungry anticipation and longing for his favorite meal. "He can make ramen," Naruto said, "he made some for me yesterday." He reached for the syrup on the table. "Pouring boiling water into instant ramen doesn't count as cooking, Naruto-kun," Rin said as she returned with a fork. Minato huffed, slouching farther before he pushed himself upright. "If that's what you think, you can make me another plate." "If I have enough batter left," Rin muttered, rolling her eyes. Smiling at the easy interaction, Naruto looked around the room as he ate through his breakfast. The kitchen was less formal than the entry hall, though a couple days ago it had been almost bare of food. And only slightly less dusty than the rest of the house. They had cleaned the long counter running along the far wall, scrubbing the wooden surface within an inch of its life to make it suitable for cooking again. Then they'd filled the cabinets beneath the counter and fridge with some groceries Jiraiya bought before adding more groceries Minato had to get to supplement the junk food Jiraiya had brought home. The line of small windows above the counter and two larger windows behind the table had also been washed, allowing the morning sunlight to stream through and light the room unhindered. Looking around again, Naruto realized who was missing from the table. "Where's the old pervert and Kakashizen?" he asked, using the nickname he decided for Jiraiya the day before after seeing the source of the Sanin's main source of income when Minato had stepped out for a moment. Somehow, he doubted respectable shinobi were supposed to make their money from publishing erotic romance novels. Minato snorted, choking on his coffee before gulping it down. He fought between laughing and coughing to clear his throat as he looked at Naruto with streaming eyes. "How did you come up with that name?" Minato choked out after regaining his voice. "What else am I supposed to call someone who writes porn novels and spends half his time planning on how to spy on women?" Naruto asked. Half of him was really curious. "He said when things blew over he was going to use me to pick up girls. Jiraiya said he was a great ninja, but if he needed a kid to trap women into talking to him." Naruto doubted how great the man could really be. Rin whirled around from the stove brandishing her spatula like a weapon. "He showed you those books?" she asked, almost seething. It was the angriest Naruto had ever seen her and made him stop his eating, looking at the medical nin with wide eyes. He decided he didn't want to see her get really angry. Suddenly unsure which was the best way to answer, he only nodded slightly before adding, "He didn't let me read them, as if I'd want to anyway." Bleg. Shaking his head at the thought, he focused back on his half-finished meal. Rin scowled, turning back to her cooking with vicious mutterings under her breath. "I knew I shouldn't have left you alone with him," Minato muttered from next to him. "But seeing as all he brought back for groceries was alcohol and snacks." Minato shook his head. "Jiraiya-sensei had to leave the village for a little while, he'll be back in maybe a week or two." "On one of his researching trips?" Naruto asked, the skepticism clear in his voice. "Oh. He told you about those, too, did he?" Minato asked as Rin tapped her spatula against the stove top impatiently. "Well, this is for actual research. What I mean is he's looking into a serious matter." Minato's expression darkened for a moment before forcibly clearing. It was so quick Naruto doubted it had really happened. Then Minato was speaking again, "Though he'll probably do some personal side research on the way." "Sensei. You shouldn't be talking about that sort of thing in front of an 8-year-old. Rin dropped a plate with one pancake on it in front of Minato. "Well, he already knows," Minato started before giving up. He frowned down at his plate. "I wanted more than this." "Well, too bad. I'm saving some for Kakashi. He's sleeping in the other room," Rin added for Naruto's benefit, "he had the second shift last night." Naruto, done with his pancakes, had been watching the back and forth with interest. "Oh," he said as Rin put another 2 pancakes on his plate. "Why does he get 2 more?" Minato asked a little petulantly, eyeing his 1 pancake. Rin didn't bother turning around as she answered from the stove. "He's a growing boy. Besides, you're the Hokage, you can't afford to get fat." Minato grumbled something in reply, but it was too low for Naruto to catch. For a moment, there was quiet as everyone focused on finishing their pancakes. Rin sat down at the other end of the table with her own plate of pancakes. She covered the few remaining and set them off to the side for Kakashi when he woke. Naruto shifted in his seat and scratched the back of his head, though it did little to relieve the growing itch. He wanted to ask what was going to happen that day. He'd been there for several days and Minato had stayed home for almost all of them, spending most of the time with Naruto, teaching him about being a ninja or playing games. Naruto loved the attention, especially when he was used to being alone so much back in his own world. It was a little strange having someone around and taking care of him, but he decided he was going to enjoy it while he could. After all, he hadn't forgotten Minato was the Hokage. Eventually the man would have to go back to work. Naruto made a conscious effort not to let his thoughts take the same dark turn they had during the night. Things seemed more promising in the daylight anyway, and he couldn't feel any lingering remnants of the nightmare that had plagued him. The bright room was empty of any hint of the red mist or the malicious feeling it brought, and the mood set by the 2 sitting at the table with him was so cheery he had difficulty even imagining something like that coming into the kitchen. Unable to take it anymore and needing a distraction from the nagging feeling in the back of his head, Naruto looked at Minato. "What are we going to do today? Can you teach me some cool new ninjutsu?" Minato hesitated before answering, and then was interrupted by a knock on the door as he opened his mouth. He stood up, moving out into the hall. Naruto hopped off his seat to follow. A short, gray-haired woman stood at the open front door holding a thick sheaf of paper. She had thick glasses and a stern expression that immediately made Naruto wary of her. "Good morning, Chayako-san," Minato smiled, opening the door wider to allow the woman inside. When she passed by the Hokage, Naruto saw a brief grimace flash over Minato's face before it settled into a polite expression once again. "Hokage-sama, Chiyoko bowed her head in a respectful gesture before looking Minato up and down. I noticed you hadn't arrived at the office yet. No, Minato said, glancing back with a guilty expression to where Naruto hung by the corner to the kitchen. Naruto felt a wash of disappointment as he realized he wasn't going to be spending the day with Minato. Real life had caught up to him. I've been having breakfast. Chiyoko followed Minato's glance and looked down at Naruto. A small frown crossed face, deepening the few wrinkles, but it passed when she looked back to Minato. I assume I don't need to remind you that the village keeps going even if you choose to take a few days off, however much they are deserved. Her voice and face softened for a moment as she said the last piece but returned to their stern expression again. If nothing else, you'll want to take care of the impressive stack of paperwork that's accumulated. Ah, yes, Minato said with a sigh, I'll be there shortly, if you would arrange the most pressing matters on top. Of course, Hokage-sama. Chiyoko gave a more formal bow before moving to the door. Her eyes landed on Naruto once more, flicking between him and Minato. The frown returned to her face as she closed the door behind her. Naruto moved from his place by the corner over to where Minato stood. You're leaving, aren't you? Sorry, Naruto-kun, Minato said as he knelt down closer to Naruto's level. His expression was so sincere Naruto almost believed him. I do have responsibilities to take care of, as much as I'd like to stay and spend more time with you. Minato's voice brightened, I'll be back for dinner, though, and maybe lunch if I can get through enough work in time. We can do something together then. Naruto shrugged, putting a smile on his face to hide his disappointment. All right. Minato stood up and moved to the closet where he grabbed his white and red Hokage jacket. Look after him, Rinchin, he said to the kunoichi who had followed them from the kitchen. Rin nodded with a smile and Minato disappeared out the door. Minato huffed out a breath as he looked at the tall stack of paperwork he had just finished. It would have been satisfying seeing how much he had accomplished if not for the even larger stack of unfinished work that still needed reviewing. He very carefully avoided looking at those. He couldn't avoid looking at the clock, though, and had to bite back a groan as he realized that he was going to miss lunch, again. This would be the second day he missed having lunch with Naruto. His second day back in the office and he still hadn't worked through all of the backlog of work left from the impromptu vacation that he'd taken. Last night he'd gotten home late, deluding himself into thinking he could finish it all in one long run. He'd come home to find Naruto halfway put to bed. Under Kakashi's somewhat distracted eye. Minato could only be thankful that his student had wrapped the book cover in day-old newspaper. Today Minato had been sure to arrive at the office at his normal time, only stopping to see Naruto briefly before heading out the door. He was determined to catch up on his work, hoping that if he could get to his normal level of papers and forms needing attention he would have more time to focus on his son. He also wanted to establish some of his normal schedule considering the rumors that had sprung up during his short absence. It seemed even a small break in the routine he had kept for over 6 years was enough to encourage the most ridiculous rumors, everything from him having a secret lover and child to him being an imposter. Minato even heard of one saying he had deeged himself and it was a double standing in for the Hokage until the situation was remedied. Perhaps things have been a bit too peaceful if all my shinobi have to do is gossip about the Hokage's free time, Minato grumbled to himself as he lifted another stack of forms off of the pile next to his desk. Then he remembered the situation that Naruto had come from, the half-destroyed room he'd seen through the mirror, and the enemy shinobi standing in the very heart of the Hokage Tower in the other world and blanched at the thought of the alternative. He'd much rather handle a few rumors than deal with a village-wide invasion. Still, it didn't change the fact that Minato needed to figure out what he was going to tell people. Rumors left to themselves would only grow and could become dangerous. Minato blinked, realizing he had read half a page of the document before him and hadn't taken in any of it. With another exasperated huff, he threw down his pen and leaned back in his chair, granting himself a few minutes to think before resuming the paper war. Despite all of his more cunning instincts, Minato wanted to tell everyone that Naruto was his son. There was no way around it. He wanted to be open about his boy, not hide Naruto away like an embarrassing secret. He had a feeling that was how Naruto had been treated most of his life, and Minato wanted this village, this Konoha, to be different. However, Minato couldn't think of a way to do it without causing more problems. Coming out and saying it would lead to questions and threats. It was a well-known fact that his son had been stillborn. They'd buried Naruto and his mother along with the other dead from Kyuubi's rampage years before in the presence of the entire village. Then, there was also the danger Naruto would face from assassination attempts made by other villages when word eventually got out about the newly revived Hokage's son. Minato ran his hands over his face and scowled down at the paper before him. He knew that there was a way to approach the situation. If anything, dealing with the rumors and explaining Naruto's presence was the easiest obstacle in his path, considering that the others consisted of a war in another version of reality, a potential enemy in his own reality that wielded the legendary Rinnegan, and any number of personal problems that Naruto had stemming from the seal on the boy's stomach to the seal apparently buried in the boy's subconscious. That wasn't even taking into account any complications that could arise from the previously mentioned problems. Groaning, Minato dropped his head into his hands, resting his arms on the desk. Thinking about this was only ruining his mood and giving him a headache. He was too close to the problem to analyze it in a completely rational manner. His emotions were too wrapped up, too invested, in Naruto, and that was just as frustrating as anything else. He was used to being the level-headed leader that could make difficult decisions, even when no one else wanted to, but now, after so many years alone and finally having a chance of a family again, Minato couldn't remove himself enough from the problem to find an answer. If paperwork is that painful, I hope I never have to become Hokage. Kakashi's relaxed voice broke into Minato's inner debate. Just wait, till I give you a genin team to train, you'll have your fair share of forms to fill out, Minato grumbled, lifting his head from his hands to look at his former student. Kakashi was perched in the open window, dressed in his black ninja uniform and green jounin vest. I'll fail them all, then I won't have to worry about it, Kakashi replied, dropping to the floor and settling into a chair. His one eye glanced over the several stacks of pending forms still waiting by the desk. Is all that really from skipping just a few days of work? He asked, a little incredulous. Backlog of work, then everything from yesterday and today added in, as well. The next Chunin exam is coming up and things are always more busy, Minato reminded his subordinate. That time of year already? I'd forgotten about it, Kakashi muttered, folding his arms over his chest. At least it should be in another village this year, right? Thankfully yes, Minato agreed, picking up the form that he had failed to read before. That's the last thing I need, is welcoming foreign shinobi into the village when we have a potential enemy out there who's already proved themselves willing to attack the village. Kakashi grunted in agreement. Minato had explained about the man and woman he'd seen through the mirror later on that same night. When should we hear back from Jiraiya-sensei? Who knows? Hopefully soon, Minato sighed, starting at the top of the paper for the third time. Hesitating a moment, Kakashi spoke up in a leading tone, if you don't mind me saying so, sensei, you look like it's more than just the paperwork on your mind at the moment. Minato looked up at the student who he considered to be a very close friend. He breathed out a chuckle, letting the paper drop to the desk again. How could I not? Between everything's that happened. Though right now my main source of concern is what to do about Naruto's presence. Chiyoko undoubtedly noticed something, and rumors are already starting to spread that we've managed to keep Naruto out of the public eye, but the few times he was out were enough to get people talking. It probably wouldn't be a problem except he looks so much like me. Minato couldn't help but smile at the thought, even if a part of him wished that Naruto looked a little more like his mother. We can't exactly deny he's related to you, the resemblance is a little too strong, Kakashi agreed. I narrowed as he contemplated the problem. Perhaps we could tell everyone he's your cousin, or nephew more like. That's a possibility, Minato agreed before shrugging his shoulders in a jerking movement, but I want to be able to call him my son. Kakashi was quiet a moment, contemplating the Hokage's dilemma. He knew how much the man's family had meant to him, how much Minato had looked forward to being a father. Why don't we tell the truth then? Or at least a part of it, he said, struck by a moment of inspiration. We can't tell them about the mirror, Minato said, knowing this would be at least one thing they would have to change in the story they told everyone. No, we can't say anything about that, Kakashi agreed with a nod, but we could tell them that Naruto didn't actually die, that you only reported that he died then placed him into hiding for his own protection. Minato didn't answer right away, thinking over the idea. It could work, and it would explain Naruto's sudden appearance in the village. However, a part of him felt like he was betraying the memory of his own son and simply replacing him with this new Naruto. Kakashi, ever observant despite the disinterested look in his eye, seemed to read Minato's thoughts. Our Naruto is dead, sensei. You're not betraying him or his memory by taking in this Naruto. Minato didn't answer for a long moment. He knew Kakashi was right. Lingering over the dead was like a death in and of itself and more harmful than helpful, especially when the living went ignored because of it. He'd been mourning for 8 years, it had been long enough. Besides, Kushina would kick his ass when he saw her next if he passed up this chance just because he felt a little uncomfortable over what he had to tell the village. We'll have to tell Naruto first, Minato sighed. He couldn't help but be nervous at the thought of that conversation. He didn't know how Naruto would react, he'd had so little time with his son that Minato still didn't really know him. And if we do that then I won't be able to just give him back to his original village if the Sandaime asks. Were you really planning to anyway? Kakashi asked, his tone one of mild surprise mixed with doubt. No, Minato admitted, but a ninja should always keep their options open. It's probably a good thing Jiraiya Sensei is away. He might not agree with rushing into this. Kakashi crossed his arms over his chest and looked down at his feet. Minato could see the frown showing through his student's mask. As you say, if the other village demands Naruto back and we refuse it could mean inviting open conflict with them. They have the advantage since they can send troops over and we can't do the same. Well, there's an easy solution to that, Minato muttered, eyes narrowing for an instant. If things look like they're turning that way I'll destroy the mirror, but until then, some enemy has already destroyed their village. If there's even the possibility that the same threat exists here I want to know about it and right now the best way to gain information is through the mirror. Minato paused, once again weighing the dangers and benefits of keeping the device intact. It was a delicate balancing act, one that was becoming even trickier after discovering that an enemy had access to the other side. Shaking his head, Minato pushed the matter from his mind. He had made his decision for the time being. If it still bothered him when he went home he would take some time then to reevaluate. He wasn't going to be able to act much on it until the paperwork got done anyway. Looking up again, he frowned at Kakashi. What are you doing here, anyway? Minato asked, you're supposed to be guarding Naruto and the house. Ah, Kakashi said, the ghost of a sheepish grin stretching his mask. I thought it would be wise to get out of the house for a little bit. Naruto's been laying traps everywhere. Traps? Minato repeated in a confused voice. What do you mean? I mean, he's got almost the entire house booby-trapped. I think he's bored. He's already tried to lead me into a few of them. Now he's working on Rinzen. In all honesty, I don't want to be around when he finally catches her off guard. Kakashi pulled out his book and settled into a more comfortable position before flicking it open to a well-worn page. Maybe it wouldn't be a bad thing to work late tonight, Minato muttered, turning to the form in front of him. He flinched at the thought of coming to a trap-laden house and an angry Rin before determinedly focusing on the words before him. Maybe the fourth time reading it through would go better. XXXXX, Naruto-kun, are you in here? Rin called. From her voice it sounded like she was near the door. Naruto clamped his hands over his mouth, trying to stifle the snickers that attempting to issue forth. He couldn't afford to make any noise, it would ruin everything. He curled up into a tight ball, pulling in his legs with his elbows. He desperately wanted to look, but knew that if he tried he'd get caught. So with a patience which he lacked in everything else he did, Naruto sat still and waited. Rin only had to come a few more feet into the room. Just a few more feet. Naruto-kun, Rin's voice was getting a little exasperated. This is GEAH, the sentence ended with a shriek of surprise as cans clattered down, raining paint and glitter over everything. Pushing himself further under the desk to avoid the worst of the splatter, Naruto couldn't help the burst of uncontrollable laughter that slipped out between his hands. The cans stopped rolling, bumping into furniture as they dripped trails of paint across the wood floor. There were a few moments of shocked silence. Then, Naruto flinched, even as a wide smile spread over his face. He thought no one would ever trip one of his pranks. Kakashi had disappeared and Rin had managed to pick most of them out, but she apparently missed the one in the spare room where Naruto had hidden. Unable to take it anymore, Naruto slowly poked his head out from under the desk. Rin was covered in a rainbow of paint and glitter Naruto had found stored in an old bedroom, arms held out from her sides, a look of shock and quickly growing anger on her face. As soon as he poked his head out, her eyes focused on him. Ha! Rinshin your COV. Naruto stopped as he saw the angry look in her eyes, only then remembering his earlier decision to avoid making her mad. Naruto, Rin growled, low and threatening. Naruto said, the smile falling from his face. Then, he shot out from under the desk, dodging past Rin's knees and grasping fingers and out into the hall, his painted footprints tracking over the wooden floor. You're dead! Rin yelled, chasing after him. Naruto grinned to himself. He was going to pay for this when Rin caught him, but until then it certainly livened up the boring afternoon. Naruto briefly wondered if he could lead her into any of the other traps before he was cornered. With another laugh, he turned toward the nearest one. He was already in trouble, might as well make the most of it. XXXXX Pain bent over the charred and destroyed remains of the Hokage's personal files. The vast majority of them were destroyed beyond recovery and the few that were readable only contained gibberish which looked like it belonged to personnel files. As useful as information on specific ninja could be, they had a spy for that. The more important goal was finding anything relating to the mirror in the lower levels. The mirror had not activated since the first incident, and though Pain had thoroughly examined both it and the room where it was stored, he could find no more indications regarding activating or manipulating the device. All he had were those few seconds of observing of the chakra flow. He had sketched out the chakra paths and their possible implications on a scroll, but it wasn't much to go by if he wanted to know the specifics on the mirror. Conan had taken over most of the tactical direction, bothering him with only the most important issues as he tirelessly searched. He'd also ordered their spy to find anything relating to the object stored in the lowest levels of the tower, hoping the spy would produce more information than ruined documents. Konoha's ninjas tasked with getting rid of their most sensitive information had done a good job, and Pain started to wonder if he was wasting his time. Perhaps it would have been better to assign some subordinates to this job, but on reconsideration he couldn't entrust this task to anyone else. No one else would know what to look for regarding the mirror. Then, finally, late in the night he discovered something. It was a half-remnant of a half-thought, a scribbled idea on the edge of a burnt scroll. It was only through sheer luck that the small fragment had not been completely obliterated like the other destroyed documents and sensitive information, but sometimes sheer luck turned the tides of battle and changed the fates of nations. Pain knew this quite well and was more than willing to exploit any advantage he uncovered to gain his goal. It was difficult to say for certain, but Pain had a feeling the partial seal in the scroll had something to do with the crystal glass that they had discovered deep below the Hokage Tower. He wouldn't be able to learn much more from the fragment. It didn't contain enough information to shed any more light on how the mirror worked, but it gave him hope that there were other pieces of salvageable information within the pile of ashes. Energy renewed despite the late hour, pain redoubled his efforts. Losing the Kyuubi was not an option and he would not let himself fail. XXXXX, I'm sorry, I'm not authorized to give out that information, the harried desk nin said, simultaneously shifting through a pile of folders on an old table set up as her workspace. It could be vital to our counter-strategy, Kyu bit out through clenched teeth. How can we know what to plan for if we don't know what they acquired in the areas they overtook? The kunoichi pinched her nose and closed her eyes for a moment, leaning an elbow on the splintered and charred surface. The sudden weight made the makeshift desk tilt on uneven legs. Kakashi could hear her sigh even from his place hidden in the shadows. I've already told you, she said, as though she were explaining to a particularly dense toddler, only ANBU and those with special clearance are allowed to know what was in the lower levels of the tower, but, if you want to know, she continued through the interruption, one finger raised to stop the man mid-sentence, you'll have to submit a written request detailing the specific information you need to know. We're at war. Kyu exclaimed, slamming a hand down on the table, making it wobble and spill documents down onto the dirty floor. We can't sit around waiting for written requests and red tape to get the things we need. The kunoichi slammed her own hands down on the table and leveled a withering glare at the man harassing her. She pushed herself up to her full height, which unfortunately was still half a head shorter than Kyu, but managed to look threatening nonetheless. Exactly. We're at war with an invasion force inside our own walls. Right now, maintaining proper security is more important than ever considering the massive amount of intelligence compromises we already know about and not to mention the many leaks we probably don't know about. If you want to see sensitive information of that classification, you have to get me proof you can see it. Now get out before I call someone in to escort you out. Kakashi silently applauded the girl as Kyu cursed under his breath and whirled around toward the door. Kakashi knew that she was only a newly promoted chunin. She passed in the previous exam several months ago and now she was standing up to someone technically her senior since Kyu was slated to test for Jounin very soon. Looking at the girl's blood-shot eyes and haggard face, Kakashi supposed that she was too tired to deal with pushy and unauthorized requests, no matter from whom they came. Slipping out the door after Kyu, Kakashi followed his suspect until the man returned to his own office. After seeing Kyu enter the cramped and disorganized room, the copynin turned for the Hokage's office to report. He'd been following Kyu for almost 2 days, tailing the man's every move, listening to his conversations, and sneaking peeks at what he was working on in his department. He'd checked what areas Kyu had been involved with and many of them had been compromised in one form or the other. Adding it all together, Kakashi was reasonably certain he had pinpointed their spy. Kyu's latest attempt to glean information on the contents of the tower's lower levels only backed up the other evidence he had, however circumstantial. They needed to be sure, though, if they were going to move. They could not afford to follow a false trail and tip the real spy off, sending them back to their employers, or worse, deeper underground in the Konoha forces. Kakashi had an idea for confirming his suspicions, but there would be risks involved. He needed the Hokage's permission and help if he was going to set up his trap. The Sandaime was still in his office, as he always seemed to be since the invasion's start. Kakashi didn't know how the older man found the energy. Though, looking at the haggard face in front of him, he knew this would be the Hokage's last war and one way or another they would need to find a new leader at the end of it. The Hokage looked twice the age he had only a week ago, which wasn't saying much considering how old the man was in the first place. The Sandaime looked up and saw Kakashi standing in the doorway. He nodded his head, granting entry. Kakashi-san, have you found any new information on your suspect? Hokage-sama, Kakashi said, bowing in greeting as he fully entered the room. I have, sir. He glanced around at the other occupants, members of Intel with charts and papers before them. Sandaime, noticing his glance, nodded to the others in the room. If you would excuse us, we can continue the briefing in a few moments. The Intelni nodded and gathered their papers and scrolls, bowing themselves out of the room. Kakashi waited until the last one had left and shut the door behind him, his eye following the stragglers' every last move out the door. "What news do you have of our spy?" the Sandaime asked, not waiting for Kakashi and getting straight to the point. They didn't have the time to prevaricate. Kakashi nodded, appreciating the direct opening. "The majority of the evidence I have points to the one man I mentioned earlier. Though there are several others who could also fit, but I believe this man Q is most likely the spy." "But you don't have definitive proof," the Hokage stated, not bothering making it a question. He held his pipe, curling with smoke, clenched between his teeth. It was one of the few comforts that the aging leader had in the days since the invasion. Kakashi paused a moment, a little embarrassed to admit it. "No, sir, there's no proof one way or another for any of them. I do, however, have a plan to draw out the right one." The Sandaime set aside several maps and lists in a pile on the corner of the desk and fixed Kakashi with all of his attention. "What is your plan? I don't need to remind you we're limited on what we can do at the moment, being stretched as thin as we are. We can't really afford to keep diverting intel away from that office you recommended. The others are becoming overly taxed, though that can't be helped." "I understand, Hokage-sama," Kakashi said with a nod. "The plan is simple enough. We'll use information as bait to draw the traitor out and then capture them. I will need several shinobi skilled in capturing targets alive, but other than that only the information to set the trap." "Good," the Sandaime approved, "the sooner we take care of this traitor the better. Hopefully they haven't managed to slip any more into our forces undetected." "What information will you need?" Kakashi didn't let himself hesitate, though he knew the importance of the particular intel for which he was going to ask. "I need information on the objects stored in the lower level of the tower." The Hokage stopped, pulling the pipe from his mouth as he stared at Kakashi. "That is extremely sensitive information. I'm not sure we can take the risk of losing it should the spy escape. Is there anything else you can use to bait your trap?" Thinking about it, Kakashi shook his head. The one common denominator between all of the suspects is they have all tried to obtain information on the lower levels of the Hokage Tower, though it is classified far about their clearance level. My main suspect especially, has been attempting to get a hold of this information even when he gave up on other pieces of more practical intel. Whoever it is has also gotten more careful over the last couple of days, except for the repeated attempts on the information I specified. They may be suspicious that we know there's a spy in our ranks. If we truly want to draw this person in, I believe we need to use something they can't refuse, and considering how much they seem to be trying to get the information on the Hokage Tower, this may be the only thing sweet enough to draw the fly into the trap. The Hokage sighed, clamping down so hard on his pipe that Kakashi thought he might break his teeth. The old man growled in frustration, rising from his chair and pacing down the length of the room. "You do not know how dangerous that information can be," he said, visibly fighting with himself. Kakashi thought that he knew very well how dangerous it could be. There were many dangerous items kept in the lowest part of the Hokage Tower, weapons, research projects, forbidden jutsu, all of which could be used against Konoha now that they were in enemy hands. Perhaps if we knew precisely what part of the information he wants, if he's just looking for general information on what they now have in their possession. The Hokage growled again, looking directly at Kakashi with a glare the younger man knew wasn't meant for him. "I know exactly what they want, and I'm afraid nothing less will satisfy the spy and draw him completely out." Hesitating, Kakashi asked anyway, "What exactly is it they're after?" The Sandaime didn't answer right away. Instead his gaze swung past Kakashi to the far wall. He stood, pipe clenched in his teeth, hands clasped behind his back for a long moment, lost in thought. The information concerns where Naruto was sent and how to retrieve him. Kakashi felt an added weight settle in his chest. If the spy did manage to evade their trap with the information, they would be putting Naruto in danger. The last thing Kakashi wanted to do was allow any more harm to befall his sensei's son. There was speculation that one of the reasons why Amigakure had invaded with IWA in the first place was to obtain the Kyubi. With the Demon Fox, their small country would have added to their military and political strength. No definitive evidence had been found to support the theory, but knowing that this spy was looking for information related to Naruto's location certainly lent weight to it. "I see," was all he could say after a moment. Still, Kakashi braced himself. They were at war with the entire village, all its citizens, and even the security of the Land of Fire as a whole was at stake. They couldn't afford to back down or lose this battle. From the way the Hokage's shoulders slumped then straightened, he knew that his leader had come to the same conclusion. "I will give you some of the information to use in your trap. I'll edit what I can without compromising its apparent authenticity," the Hokage said, sounding more laden than moments before. "Take whatever people you need for it within reason, but don't keep them too long. They're needed on the front lines, as well." "Thank you, Hokage-sama," Kakashi nodded, mentally reviewing the names of those still alive and well enough to help in the capture. "Kakashi," the Sandame's voice was grave and serious, all the more so without the honorific. "I expect you to capture this spy. If you can't capture him, kill him, and if you can't kill him under no circumstances allow him to obtain that information." "Hi, Hokage-sama," Kakashi bowed low, understanding exactly what the Hokage was entrusting him with and knowing he would rather be dead than return without the spy captured and alive or the man's head. For this mission more than any other, he had to succeed. The Hokage let out a deep sigh, sorrow and weariness filling the sound as he dropped himself into his chair. "It will be a large gamble, Kakashi-kun." Kakashi nodded again, speaking quietly. "Hi, Hokage-sama, but sometimes in war you need to wager a large gamble if you wish to win. The spy will not come out for any paltry bait. We need to make the temptation worth the risk of them losing their place in our ranks." "I know, it can't be helped," the old man said, slumped in his chair, chin resting on his hands. In a moment he recovered himself, seeming to remember Kakashi was in the room. "Very well, you know what you need to do. Send in the others, we need to get this briefing finished." Straightening his back, the Hokage pulled the papers back in front of him and gestured for Kakashi to leave. Kakashi bowed low once more, a part of him glad he wasn't in the old man's position. Then, he turned and left, motioning to the waiting intel team so that they could re-enter the room. He knew that they were making the right choice. They simply couldn't afford to have a spy in their midst when the situation was already so dire. Still, as Kakashi left the makeshift headquarters, he couldn't help but wonder if they had just made the first step in giving the enemy the key to Naruto. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.